Hello, everybody. My name is Patrick, and this is my list of my 12 favorite albums of 2017. In this video, we're going to be talking about albums 12, 11, 10, and 9. This being the bottom of my list, it means that these albums are a bit interchangeable. There's a few albums that were really close to making it on the list that didn't, that I might, on a different day, substitute in for some of these, but that shouldn't diminish the importance of these albums. So let's go ahead and start the list. Number 12 on my list is a really interesting and fun album called Pacifisticuffs by Diablo Swing Orchestra. And if you've never heard of them before, I don't blame you for one. But secondly, I like to describe them as a metal band that plays Disney songs. So think something jazzy or swingy like something from the Aristocats soundtrack, but done by a metal band. So if that sounds interesting, please go check them out. The reason this album is on number 12 on my list and not higher is because one, it is a very recent album. It came out on December 7th, and I believe I'm recording this on the 27th or the 28th. So it's new, and I haven't had much time to really digest it yet. However, it made enough of an impression on me to make it onto my list. The reason it's not higher is because there's 13 tracks on this album, and of the 13 tracks, only 8 of them are really full songs. There's, I think, 4 sort of intermission tracks that are just like 30 seconds long that are kind of little ambient things. And while I think that's cool to give the album a feel overall, I wish bands really wouldn't do that. And then there's one or two sort of little intermission songs that are cool songs, little instrumental pieces that are nice, but I wouldn't really count them as a full song. So that's the reason that this is number 12 on my list and not further up. One other thing to mention about this album is that I like their previous albums a bit more, specifically their album that came out before this in 2012 that was called Pandora's Pinata. That album is awesome in my opinion, but it's approached from a much more metal standpoint, whereas this album is approached from a bit more of a classical standpoint. If you're listening with headphones, you can really hear the clarity and the specific panning structure of each instrument. When there's a string section, you can clearly hear the string section. When the brass is playing, you can clearly hear the brass. And that's cool, but I wish that the mix would have a bit more character to it like it did have on their previous album. The guitar is a lot less heavy on this album. It still sounds heavy, but there's really only one track that is there, and everything is still balanced well, but I just feel like this album isn't overall recorded, or at least it wasn't mixed as well as their previous album. So that's why it's number 12 on my list and not any higher. If you like different sort of avant-garde maybe style music, I would recommend giving this a chance. It's not too heavy, and there's not a lot, if any, screaming vocals at all. So when I say metal, don't think crazy screamy metal. Think more along the lines of classic rock or something like that, but with a lot of different circusy type of jazz or swing elements. So that's number 12. Number 11, however, is the screamy, guttural, metal sound. This is the band Arch Enemy and their album Will to Power. And this is actually my first Arch Enemy album. And it made it on my list because it was almost more of a surprise to me how much I liked it than I actually did like it, if that makes sense. There were a few other metal bands that came out with albums this year, like In This Moment and Xandria, for example. I liked those albums a lot, specifically the Xandria one. I liked that album a lot, and it could have made it on my list, but I decided to put this on the list instead of that because it surprised me how much I liked it. There are clean vocals on this album, though they're pretty sparse. For the most part, it's guttural, screaming, grunting metal vocals, all done by this very pretty blue-haired lady. I don't know if you can see there. When I was looking them up and found out about them in this new album, I was watching a bunch of videos of them on YouTube, and it's really, really cool to see them performing live. So if anything I mentioned sounds interesting to you, please look them up. They seem like they're really cool to see live. The metal, in terms of the style, is very Gothenburg style, Scandinavian metal sound. A lot of heavy rhythmic riffs that are pretty fast, a lot of double bass drumming. But over the top of all that is a lot of lead guitar playing, and the guitar players are great. There's a lot of solos. There's one or two solos in every song. The solos are very cool, soaring, fast, sweeping solos that are really neat. They have a bunch of keyboards in their music, which is a surprise to me. I didn't know that was going to be in there, and that kind of creates a cool atmosphere, almost sort of like a throwback 80s sort of atmosphere to it. Not 80s synth pop, but more sort of like, I guess a bit Iron Maiden, Judas Priest-ish, I guess. Anyway, a very cool metal band, and it made my list on number 11 because it surprised me. So if you're into metal and you haven't heard them before, please check them out. If you're into female-fronted metal bands, please check them out, but no, it's going to be mostly screaming metal and not necessarily soaring, singing female soprano vocals, something like Xandria would be. So that is Will to Power by Arch Enemy, number 11. Number 10 on my list is a bit of a disappointment to me overall. This is Skin and Earth by Lights. For those of you that know me personally, you know how much I love Lights and her two previous albums specifically. They are albums that are in my top favorite albums of all time. This album, I feel, is a disappointment in compared to those two previous albums. And it's disappointing for a few reasons. One, and the main reason, is the mixing on this album. It is not made very well. All the sounds and everything were recorded well and for the most part mixed well, but it is just so overcompressed. The mastering was done very poorly, I think. There are some songs on this album that actually have bad distortion on them. Not this type of distortion that adds character to music, like she did a lot on her previous album, Siberia, but this is just clean signals that ended up distorting because they were pushing the levels so hard. And that's an absolute no-no in my book. That being said, there's a few really great songs on here, and I enjoy listening to it while I'm driving around, and it's the kind of album that you can just put on and enjoy at any time, really. If you're going to sit and listen to it with headphones, it might not be the best thing for really intensive listening, but because it's so good to listen to as just a general album, I still think that's kind of why it makes it on my list. But in terms of why I think it's a little bit subpar, other than the mixing of the album, which again is a very important thing to me personally, while she was making this album, she was actually releasing a companion set of comic books, basically, with this album. So there's 14 tracks on this album, and she released 7 issues of a comic book series. In each issue, it dealt with 2 of the specific different tracks. So it's a cool story that she created. This album is a concept album. It has to do with the story, and listening to the songs, you wouldn't really necessarily get that, but the songs in the comic book really put the story together. And the story she wrote is really cool, and it's pretty original, and I like it a lot, but I don't think that the comic books make up for the fact that the music is a little bit subpar. In fact, I actually think that her focusing on the comic book might have distracted her a little bit from making an album with the fullest potential that I think she has an album to make. The album is still very poppy like her previous music. It's a little bit more sort of the time. It feels very much like Taylor Swift's newest album or Halsey or something like that, Lord-ish. And that's a little bit disappointing because I know she has it in her to create music that's very special. And I feel like in this overall project, the album ended up taking a bit of a back seat to possibly the story and the artwork, which again is cool. And if that sounds interesting to you, I highly recommend picking it up or finding a copy of the graphic novel because it's interesting. But at the end of the day, it ended up very low on my list. And this is the kind of thing that had it been what I wanted it to be, it would have been at the absolute top of my list based on her 2 previous albums. But it's a little disappointing for that reason, but still great and still on my list, just farther down than I think it should be. So the last album we're going to talk about, number 9 on my list, this is the album Humans by the Gorillaz. I'm a huge Damon Albarn fan, and for those of you who don't know, Damon Albarn is the guy that does most of the music and the singing for the Gorillaz. He started it back in 2001 after his band Blur broke up. And so I'm a big fan of all of their previous work, and this album is disappointing to me compared to that because I love that stuff so much, but it's still a very enjoyable album. I feel like this album is an album that has kind of been made for a generation that's younger than I am. This is very much an album, kind of like the Lights album, that is of this time. It is a style of music, a style of hip hop music, a style of rap music that I don't really enjoy very much. There's some trap influence stuff on here, and everything is very crisp, clear sounds, but it doesn't have the sort of 80s throwback Casio vibe of their previous album, Plastic Beach. This is much more of a modern electronic hip hop rap record. And it makes it on the list because there's a few songs on here that are absolutely incredible, and they make it in my list of top probably 5 favorite Gorillaz songs of all time. And those songs are She's My Collar, which is my favorite song on the album. It's towards the end of the album. Very cool, very a bouncy song. I like it a lot. And then the song at the beginning of the album called Moments, which I believe features De La Soul. That song's really great, very hectic and very sort of unexpected for this album and the Gorillaz in general. Overall, kind of as with the Lights album, I feel disappointed about this album in that we only get a Gorillaz album every 4 or 5 years or so, and when it comes out, I want it to be as good as possible. And I think that this album is as good as possible for the style that it was, but I know that Damon has it in him to make a better Gorillaz album, though that's kind of, whatever, neither here nor there. This album in particular, one thing that I did enjoy about it was that it is made and structured like a hip-hop or rap album, in that there's songs and then there's intermission songs, kind of like what was on the Diablo Swing Orchestra album, except I feel like this album is made in such a way that you get the most out of it by listening to the album as a whole. So the little 5-second, 30-second tracks in between songs are just as important as the songs themselves, and I think he's managed to make an album that is a full album that feels like a single piece of media. And I have the deluxe edition, which comes with the bonus disc here. And the bonus disc is actually just as good as the regular album, albeit very short comparatively. But I still feel like it's great. So this album is disappointing to me overall, but it's a Gorillaz album. It's Damon Albarn, which is why it makes it on my list. And there's a couple songs on it that are so great, I can't deny it. And that's how it ends up on my list. So that was the very bottom of my list of my 12 favorite albums of 2017. Like I said, those albums are a bit interchangeable, and they were close to not making it on the list. There were some albums that were close to making it on the list, but I wanted to include these albums and talk about them with you. I've been making lists like this since 2009, and I really enjoy doing stuff like this and sharing it with people out there. So if you found a band that you liked that you didn't know before, please let me know in the comments. In the description of this video, I'm going to add a link to a song from each of these albums so that if it sounded like something you would be interested in and you want to check it out, you can just click on that link. And hopefully I'll be able to get a link down there to each of the 2 other videos in this series that I'm making, talking about songs 8, 7, 6, 5, and then a final video talking about the final 4. So for now, this is Patrick, and I hope that 2018 is just as good as 2017 was. Thank you very much for watching.